2 Samuel 9. It is wise to keep the promises that I have made to others. David and Jonathan were the very best of friends. They really cared about each other and respected each other, even though David was a nobody and Jonathan was the son of King Saul. After David killed Goliath the giant, he and Jonathan became best friends. Jonathan knew that God had said David would be king one day instead of him. But Jonathan wasn't jealous of David. Jonathan respected God's choice. But some very sad days came to their friendship. King Saul decided he would make sure Jonathan became king, not David. So Saul began trying to kill David. David began to run and hide, but Jonathan remained his loyal friend and did all he could to help David stay safe. Each time they met, they knew it might be the last time they met. So because of that, they made promises to each other, even about their children. In 1 Samuel 20, verses 14 and 15, Jonathan said to David, "And thou shalt not only while yet I live show me the kindness of the Lord, that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth." David was glad to make this promise, and Jonathan trusted David to keep his promise because he knew that David loved and obeyed God. What they did not know was that Jonathan would later die in a battle with the Philistines, along with his father Saul. More and more battles would follow, but one day the people of Israel came to David and asked him to be their king, just as God had promised. Finally, David was the king, sitting in his palace in Jerusalem. That's when David had a chance to think about his promise to Jonathan. He remembered the promise he had made to King Saul's son, Jonathan, to show kindness to his family and descendants. You see, when a new king came to power, the people who were loyal to that king often went out and killed anyone from the previous king's family. And because so much of that had happened, David really didn't know if any members of Saul and Jonathan's family were still alive. David asked his advisors, "Is there anyone belonging to Saul's family to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Instead of trying to kill Saul's family, David wanted to honor his promise to Jonathan. The king asked Ziba, "Is there anyone still alive from Saul's family to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba replied, "There is Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who is lame in both feet." He was Jonathan's own son. Mephibosheth had been a young child at the palace when a messenger ran to announce news of King Saul's death and that the Philistines were coming. Remember what they usually meant for a member of the dead king's family? Death. So Mephibosheth's nanny grabbed him. She ran to save his life, but she dropped him. It seems that the bones in his feet and ankles were crushed. The broken bones healed, but now they were crooked, so Mephibosheth could not walk normally or work to support himself. Ever since then, he'd been far away, hiding out, just in case anyone still wanted to kill him because of a grudge against his father or grandfather. "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba explained that Mephibosheth was living at Lodabar. David had an idea. He sent the servant to bring Mephibosheth to the palace. Now Mephibosheth might have been terrified. After all, David might kill him. Mephibosheth arrived at the palace in fear, not knowing what David would do to him. "Don't be afraid," David told him, "for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of Saul thy grandfather, and you shall eat continually at my table." Mephibosheth bowed and said, "Who am I, that you should notice such a dead dog like me?" David's words must have amazed Mephibosheth. He didn't seem to think he was worthy of the royal treatment, but that's what David gave him. David called for Ziba. "I have given Mephibosheth everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your 15 sons and 20 servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops to provide for him." Ziba was to be in charge of making sure that everything David said he wanted done was done. David then told Mephibosheth that he would always eat at the king's table with the king's sons and be treated like one of them. From that day on, all the members of Ziba's household became servants of Mephibosheth. Ziba and his servants and sons took care of the land David had restored to Mephibosheth and the food that was grown there. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem and always ate at the king's table. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and Micah and all of Mephibosheth's family came to live at the palace too. They ate with King David every day, and instead of living in fear, they lived in a palace as part of David's own family, because David had been wise and kept his promise. King David knew that God always keeps his promises, and David wanted to live in a way that would show he loved God. David kept the promise he'd made to Jonathan because David loved God and cared about his friend. This was a wise way to live. We can be wise as we keep our promises to God and others. It says in Psalm 119:57, "Thou art my portion, O Lord. I have said that I would keep thy words." The writer of this verse knew that God is everything he needed. He was glad to promise to obey God's word. We can also promise to obey God's word. Keeping that promise is wise and good. In fact, keeping all our promises is wise and good. In a game, we use scorecards to help us remember what happened, but there's something much more important to remember. We need to remember the promises that we make and keep them. We can be wise as we keep our promises to God and others. David was Jesus' ancestor. He promised to take care of Jonathan's family, no matter what. Even years after Jonathan died, David kept his promise. He brought Jonathan's son to the palace to live like David's own family. And God made a promise too. After Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, He promised to make things right again. He kept that promise when Jesus died and rose again to make us right with God. Now God invites us to His table and into His family, because Jesus made the way for God's promise to come true. So remember, it's wise to keep the promises that you've made to others.